Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of the Voices of CIVICA podcast series. Today, we're at the LSE with the Grimshaw podcast, and I'm your host, Zara. In this episode, we're revisiting Europe by exploring how major political issues can reshape democratic politics and voter identities. Our conversation focuses on Brexit and the broader question of how debates about European integration can transform domestic political competition. For decades, political competition in Europe was largely structured around the classic left-right divide. But in recent years, debates over European integration, globalization, and national sovereignty have increasingly challenged those traditional political boundaries. In Britain, the referendum on EU membership created a powerful new divide between Leave and Remain, raising important questions about how foreign policy issues can transform domestic political identities and political competition. To help us understand these developments, we're joined by Professor Sara Hobolt, the Sutherland Chair in European Institutions and Professor in the Department of Government at the London School of Economics. Her research focuses on elections, referendums, public opinion, and European Union politics. She is also the chair of the European Election Studies, an EU-wide project studying voters, parties, candidates, and the media in European parliamentary elections. Professor Hobolt's research focuses on elections, referendums, and public opinion, and the European Union politics. She's the co-author of several books, including Political Entrepreneurs, The Rise of Challenger Parties in Europe, and today we'll be discussing her forthcoming book, Tribal Politics, which examines how the debate over EU membership transformed political identities in Britain. So, Professor Hobolt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, so to start, I'd like to take a step back and look at the broader changes in European politics over the past few decades, particularly how political competition has evolved. So my first question for you is, much of your work examines how European integration shapes political competition. So how do you think the main political divisions in Europe has changed over the past few decades?
I think if we look at the transformation that is happening to European politics, there's two key things to keep in mind. One is that voters are increasingly volatile when it comes to who they vote for, and the second is that, and which is interlinked, is that the party political landscape is increasingly fragmented. And so that means that lots of new issues can emerge, and that also leads to the emergence of new challenger parties. And so if we think of what are the new salient divides in European politics, that does vary more than it perhaps have done previously because of these things. But one key issue that has become very salient over the last decades in European politics has been around immigration. And that's also one of the reasons that the radical right has been the most successful challenger party we've seen in the last decade. But that's not the only issue. Other issues, climate change, it can also be European integration that you mentioned, and so on. But generally, more issues emerge and more parties also emerge from this volatility in the electoral space.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And traditionally, European politics was structured around like left-right party competition. So do you think that divide is weakening more? And if so, what do you think is replacing it?
So if we look at party politics today, we might still think of sort of, left-right, and we might still place parties along that continuum. But as you say, if we sort of look under the hood, really the traditional economic left-right is no longer as dominant. And we can think of it in terms of sort of two main developments. One is what political scientists like to call de-alignment, and that means voters are no longer as structurally linked to parties. So the left-right divide emerged out of a divide around class, primarily in Europe. So you would have the working class having their natural affiliation with social democratic labor type parties, and the middle and upper classes with conservative and liberal type parties. And that was sort of the way in which politics was structured. It also led to partisan alignments along identification with parties that were linked to social class and so on. And so what is happening with the de-alignment is that those ties between certain social structural divides and partisanship, so identification with certain mainstream classic political parties and vote choices, that's loosening. So it's just a lot less predictable how people are going to vote, and it's not structured along divides. But that doesn't mean, so a de-alignment would just be that we have a space where we really can't predict based on your characteristics how you might vote. One election you might go one way, the other you might go another way. But that's not the whole story. I think the second part of the story is one of what we might think of as a realignment. That is that new issues emerge that are salient, like we just talked about climate change, immigration and so on, and that they also have a structural basis. And if we look at, for example, the issue of immigration or the issue of European integration, a key structural predictor there is education. So we know that the highly educated or people who've gone to university tend to vote quite differently and have quite different set of attitudes. So education is one sort of emerging structural divide that predicts attitudes and behaviors. Another is age, and another is geography. So do you live in big urban centers or do you live in towns and rural areas?
And in your research, you also argue that specific issues like EU membership can become powerful political identities as well. So why do you think issue-based identities become more influential in modern democracies?
So that's linked to, I think, that de-alignment process that we talked about. So once you're no longer as clearly tied through social class or religion to certain political parties, that also leaves space both for voters to care about other issues, but also for political entrepreneurs to come in and mobilize those issues. So in my book with Catherine de Vries on political entrepreneurs and on challenger parties, we write about how often what these challenger parties do is they mobilize issues that were not clearly linked to left-right politics. So European integration, immigration, climate change, and so on. But there's fertile ground for these entrepreneurs to be able to do that because of this de-alignment along traditional cleavage lines.
And that broader shift in political divisions becomes especially visible in the UK during the Brexit referendum. And your upcoming book, Tribal Politics, examines how Brexit created deep political divisions in Britain. What made EU membership such a powerful source of polarization in the UK?
So it's a really great question, because you might think when you look at Brexit today, 10 years on, that oh my goodness, this was such a bottom-up movement of sort of people just out on the street thinking we need a say in Europe. But in fact, this is not really how it came about. It wasn't a particularly salient issue to most British voters. I think when David Cameron first declared that he was going to have an in-out referendum in 2013, it was about 2% of the population who would mention it amongst the top issues they cared about. So it wasn't necessarily that the issue itself was one that was very salient to voters. Instead, what happened was that because of intra-party division, particularly in the Conservative Party, there was a decision to have a referendum. And then, of course, that moment, that trigger of compelling everyone to take a stance on a very important political issue, are you going to stay in this important club, and linking it with other salient issues that people cared about, immigration, the NHS, and so on, created a moment that people were compelled to take side. It was incredibly contested, not only at the time of the referendum, but also in the many years that followed, as Britain had to decide and struggled to decide the future relationship between the UK and the EU. And people were continually mobilized around those questions. So that created not only a sort of, I think the EU is a good thing or not a good thing, but something that people started identifying with as part of their identity. So, no, I'm a Leaver, a Brexiteer, or I'm a Remainer. And so it was a kind of a triggering moment that then led to this salient new political divide and even political identities around that.
Do you think people are regretting their Leave vote 7 years down the line?
That's a great question. So normally you might say, people would reflect on the decision. But part of what happens is that when we have strong political identities is, in fact, we are, and that's also what we write about in the book, we are heavily motivated to justify the choices we've made, whether it is voting to leave the European Union or remain in the European Union. So let's say you voted to leave in the European Union. Some people who voted remain might say, well, look at the economy. It's going terribly. Why have you not changed your mind? Can't you see that you made the wrong choice? And what we see in the data, that very few people who identify as leavers or Brexiteers and who voted in 2016 have changed their minds. And that is entirely in line with work on social identities, because once we've made that choice, we identify with that, we're motivated through motivated reasoning and this sort of desire not to have cognitive dissonance, that we want that to make sense. So let's say there's an economic downturn. If you're a Remainer, you might think, well, of course, it's because we left the European Union, we're now more exposed, so Brexit is partly or largely to blame. On the other hand, if you voted leave, you would see the same economic downturn, and you say, well, it might be because, our government messed up, or Putin invaded Ukraine. So you are attributing the same facts to different causes, but ones that allow you to stick with the choice. So in answer to your question, we haven't seen a lot of sort of regret over voting for Brexit, but we have seen a shift in public opinion. Now that shift in public opinion has a lot more to do with the composition of electorate than people changing their minds. So the young people coming into the electorate were overwhelmingly Remainers, and the older people leaving the electorate as they passed away were much more likely to be leavers.
And one striking feature of Brexit was that it cut across traditional party lines. So why was this issue able to divide voters in ways that the normal party system could not contain?
So the issue of the European integration, not just in Britain but in Europe, is often one that the mainstream parties struggle a bit to deal with in terms of their own partisan supporters being quite divided. So in Europe, you generally see that the mainstream parties are quite pro-European and their base is a little bit more split. Within the UK, of course, the parties themselves have been very split on the issue. So historically, the Labour Party used to be a much more Eurosceptic party with a smaller, more pro-European wing, and then it became the Conservative Party that became much more split on the issue at the party elite level. And it was in fact that split that led to Cameron ultimately calling the referendum, so the split within his own party. Now, so what happened in the referendum campaign was that you had the Conservative government led by David Cameron advocating for to remain in the European Union. But who was the leader of the Leave side? That was Boris Johnson primarily, who was of course also a very prominent Conservative politician. So if you're then a Conservative voter and you are sort of thinking of, oh, I want to follow the people I normally trust to take party cues or recommendations from, you don't know which way to look. So in that way, it wasn't easily absorbed within normal party competition, simply because the parties themselves were so split on it.
Okay. And you compare Brexit with other foreign policy issues as well, such as the Vietnam War and the United States. What similarities do you see between these cases of issue-based polarization?
So I think a key similarity here is the one of sort of the salience of the issue. So clearly the Vietnam War was an issue that for many people became extremely salient to how they looked at politics and brought them out on the streets in protest. So there was the element of really expressing your views and feeling you were part of something that was bigger than yourself, and it became part of many people's political identities, especially for those who were protesting against the war in Vietnam. But also importantly, it also split the parties, in particular the Democratic Party at the time in the US. So again, it was one of these issues where it wasn't just neatly absorbed into Republican versus Democrats, because the Democratic Party itself was split on the issue and had to, in a sense, deal with the fact that it had a big part of its support base that were very anti-war. And so that creates then the opportunity for new political identities to emerge outside the sort of traditional space of liberal, conservative or left-right politics.
And looking beyond the UK, your work also examines how voters across Europe behave more broadly. And as a chair of the European election studies, what major trends in voter behavior across Europe have you observed over the past decade?
So some of those we've already touched upon a little bit. So one is this volatility in electoral behavior. People used to be much more attached to the big party blocks, the Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, Conservatives, the Liberals, and they would occupy sort of 80+% of electoral support. And now we're seeing voters feeling less attached to these parties, be more volatile in their behavior, so they might be Conservative one election and something else in the next. And that in turn, of course, has led then to the rise of challenger parties on both the left and on the right. The most successful challengers in the last 2 decades in Europe have been the populist right. We see them now in almost every party system in Europe, and we see them having gone from being really on the fringes of politics and not really in power, to now in some countries like Hungary, like Italy, being at the heart of political power in those countries. And in other countries, of course, doing very well in the polls, like the United Kingdom, where we are, France, and Germany, and so on. So that's really a major shift, that you have these parties that were seen as kind of fringe movements now so popular. One other trend that might be interesting to you is a trend among young people, in that we are seeing, particularly in the last elections, when we studied the European Parliament elections, a youth gender gap in voting behavior. So traditionally in Europe, we haven't had a huge gender gap in how people voted. So women and men didn't vote, or don't generally vote that differently. There's other things that matter, like education, class, income, so on. But what we're seeing amongst your generation is that young men and young women vote very differently. And again, we're as researchers still trying to really figure out what's going on. So young men are much more likely to vote for the radical right than young women. And young women are moving to the left. They're more likely to vote for radical left parties, green parties, and so on. So that's a sort of interesting trend to keep looking at and trying to study and understand what's happening.
And are European voters becoming more politically engaged with EU issues, or do most citizens still primarily view politics through a more national lens?
I would say the national lens is still the key benchmark for how people think of politics, and voting for the national government or national president in a presidential system is still what we think of as the sort of first order elections. These are the most salient elections. But I think this sort of contrast to say, oh, this is European and this is national, or this is international and this is national, these divides are really eroding, because I think people understand that so many issues, some of the main challenges we face today are really cross-border issues. Think of climate change. We ask voters, they understand that this is an issue that a single country can't cope with or deal with alone. But similarly with international conflicts. I mean, Europe is now facing a situation where it's really pressured geopolitically from all sides, in terms of both the US changing its position on multilateral alliances, Putin and Russia, of course, being a real threat, and then with wars happening in Ukraine, in Iran now, and so on. So I think Europe is sort of struggling in a sense to find its place in this increasingly geopolitically uncertain world. And I think from a voter perspective, that means, I think, we as voters understand that this is not just a national issue.
Yeah. You mentioned how obviously you're seeing this like gender divide between youth, but do you think more broadly generational differences play an important role in shaping attitudes towards European integration? So even the older generations as well, do you see like a difference in voter behavior amongst them?
What we see is that older voters are still more likely to vote for mainstream parties, whether centre-left or centre-right parties. They're also the ones that are still feeling more attached to those parties, whereas younger voters are more likely to vote for newer challenger parties, both on the far left and on the far right. In the UK, we see a particularly stark age divide in how people vote, with younger voters just being much more left-wing, so much more likely to vote for what we think of as the progressive bloc, so Greens, Liberal Democrats and Labour, and older voters more likely to vote for Conservatives and Reform. Now, it will be interesting to see whether now with a centre-left government, younger voters are then going to turn against the Labour Party and no longer vote in the same sort of proportions as they have done in the last general elections. But here, the age divide is very stark in the UK.
Many of the trends that we've discussed, from Brexit to shifting voter attitudes, also point to growing political polarization across Europe. And do you feel the politicization of European integration made EU politics more democratic by increasing debate and participation, or has it simply made it more polarized?
I think a bit of both can be true, because what we did see in the Brexit vote was it was mobilizing also in a way that increased participation. And it also increased participation amongst people who were not normally that keen or that used to voting in general election. And in particular amongst people who voted Leave, we did see that a lot of those people were people who hadn't voted in the last couple of general elections. So I think that could be seen as a positive thing, more people engaging. Also, we saw on the Remain side that more people felt a stronger attachment to and more interest in Europe after the vote than they had done previously. So I do think it had also some of these positive effects in terms of interest in politics and engagement with politics.
Some critics worry that rising political polarization that we see threatens democratic stability. In your view, is this kind of issue-based polarization that we see around European integration fundamentally destabilizing, or can democracies adapt to these new divides?
It's a great question. I think one concern that we looked at also in our book on tribal politics was around this question of loser's consent. So loser's consent is that when you're not on the winning side in any kind of democratic contest, be it an election or referendum, that you accept that the outcome of this election is based on a fair and democratic process. And that's really crucial to democracies being stable, that everyone feels everyone plays by the rule of the game and they accept that that's a legitimate outcome. And what you saw after Brexit, which is not uncommon also in elections, is that those on the losing side, so the Remainers, the majority of them felt that this had not been a fair and democratic process that had led to this outcome. And I think more generally what you find when you have a lot of polarization, as we did certainly in the 6-7 years after Brexit, until the pandemic took over, becoming the more important, more salient issue, is that people were highly polarized, but also therefore had lower levels of trust in politics, in democratic institutions. And on both sides, on the Remainer side, they felt this was this terrible decision that came out of the process they didn't much like and didn't much respect, but also on the Leave or the Brexiteer side, feeling that there were attempts to kind of steal their democratic choice, to not implement Brexit and so on. So really on both sides it led to decreased political trust in institutions.
And is polarization around European integration primarily a reflection of these deeper social and economic divides, or do you think it's more driven by political mobilization or leadership?
So certainly, as we discussed briefly, what we've seen in the Brexit case was that this was not a sort of bottom-up groundswell of interest around Europe or EU membership and what it means to, be Britain in the European Union. This was really a result that came through sort of top-down processes of intra-party division over many years, particularly within the Conservative Party, that gave, particular leader at the time, David Cameron, but also prime ministers before him, an incentive to say, let's settle the question. Now, it didn't really perhaps settle the question, certainly not for many years, but that was the idea. We have a referendum, we settle the question within the party, within the country. But it was that act of deciding to have the referendum that made it salient, as opposed to, oh, it was this incredibly salient, polarizing issue in the public that then led David Cameron to have the referendum. Now, of course, it was correlated, the views on Brexit was correlated to some extent to existing divides. One was education. You saw people who were highly educated, university educated, more likely to vote to remain in the European Union, younger people, and also a geographical divide around people in urban areas, again, more likely to vote to remain. So it did correlate with socio-demographic divides, also attitudes, but it was not interest in the issue itself or the public divide that led to the decision to have the referendum. It was rather, the salience rather came from the decision to have the referendum, and then the very tumultuous years of negotiating an exit from the European Union that led to that polarization around it.
And thinking about everything that we've discussed raises the question of what the future might hold for democratic politics in Europe. So looking ahead, what do you see as the biggest challenges facing democratic politics in Europe over the next decade?
So I think one thing we've talked about a lot is this fragmentation and volatility. And I think the challenge that comes from that is one of government stability. So when you have more fragmented political systems, you have more parties that find it harder to work together. It's much harder also to have stable government. So that's a concern. You see generally then governments don't survive as long. They perhaps can't decide on important policy action as much as they can if they're more cohesive and they're more stable. And that also then presents an issue for the population in terms of accountability. If you have these very broad, very unstable coalition governments, who do you hold to account when you're not happy? Then maybe you just vote for the next new thing, and perhaps it leaves voters more susceptible to sort of easy answers by populist parties that say, oh, we would have done it all differently and better and so on. So I think that's a concern. Of course, more generally, and you'll know this studying international relations, we're just living in an incredibly uncertain time geopolitically, with this sort of liberal world order that has existed in the post-World War period, really sort of disintegrating before our eyes. And particularly for Europe, that presents a challenge, where you have these two forces. You have this pressure on the one hand being, as Europeans, we should perhaps get our act together, work more closely together to assert ourselves economically, socially, militarily as a continent. But also, we have the growth of these very strong nativist, nationalist political forces that want something quite different for Europe. So I think that poses a particular challenge to Europeans and to European governments.
And finally, how might external pressures, so you briefly touched on this, such as geopolitical tensions or economic crises, reshape political competition within these European democracies?
So I think the rise of these issue-based polarization, issue-based identities, and the weakening of existing political structures and ties just really means that we're living through an age where it's all a bit more up for grabs. So it's greater uncertainty, so it's hard for me to say, is it going to be this issue or that issue, but it means that we are just much more vulnerable in terms of what issues might emerge that might divide us and that might decide what is the key political issue of the day. And that means it's much harder for me to answer that question, but I think we're living in an era of a lot of uncertainty politically.
So Professor Hobolt, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. It's been a fascinating discussion, and we also look forward to the release of your forthcoming book, Tribal Politics, which explores these themes in even greater depth. I believe it's being released in this coming...
The end of March.
Yeah, the end of March. Okay. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to the Voices of CIVICA podcast series. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.